So in this next installment of Who Said It Better, we're not really going to inspect any passages from the Christian scriptures, but I wanted to touch on this matter of the conversion of the Emperor Nero to Judaism. One thing Robert Eisenman says in one of his books, it was either his James the Brother of Jesus or his book, I think it was called the New Testament Code, which I'm not sure I read that one all of the way through, though I tried. But in one of those books, Robert Eisenman says when something is asserted matter-of-factly that flies in the face of accepted understanding, then you should sit up and take notice. So when a good Orthodox rabbi who was teaching Torah in a classroom setting, when he told me that Nero converted to Judaism, I think I said, "What?" Because the accepted history of Nero in the or let's say the Christian or post-Christian world is that Nero was, I think that he committed suicide and that he was a persecutor of Christians. So we have to keep in mind that, again, that the Roman Flavians, during the reign of the Roman Flavians, which would have been from like 69 or 70 CE all the way to, I think it's 96 CE or AD. That's a pretty good amount of time. Nero would not have been painted in such a favorable light. Although it does appear that Josephus does say some words in Nero's defense when he writes his Antiquities during the reign of Domitian, after both Vespasian and Titus were dead. So, anyway, so here's an entry at Catholic.com, and this is just like a little article on Josephus. This is Josephus, International Man of History. But it does point out here that in AD 64, when Josephus was 27, so that's only like 5 years before the wars with the Jews began, I think, the Roman War with the Jews. He went to Rome, where he successfully pled before Nero for the release of some Jewish priests. Now, what happened when he did that? Well, that's part of the history of Poppaea, and I don't know if that's Sabina Poppaea or Poppaea Sabina, but typically she's just known as Poppaea, and that is the wife of Nero. And I think Nero is accused later on of kicking her in her belly when she's pregnant until the baby died, and maybe even, I forget, maybe even Poppaea died from that. I forget. It's not terribly important to what I'm discussing. I mean, I could look it up, but anyway, it says that she was the second wife of Nero, but then here it says for only 3 years. But here it says Josephus. So Josephus, Flavius Josephus, is the author, supposedly, of the Wars of the Jews, which is the contemporaneous or contemporary history of the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And he also wrote the Antiquities, which was kind of almost like his paraphrase of all Jewish history. So that includes what you would find in the Hebrew Tanakh all the way up to present times. So it's a pretty important resource historically for Jewish history. But although I'm told that Flavius Josephus is considered reliable and legit in Jewish circles, I rarely hear anyone in Orthodox Jewish circles quoting Flavius Josephus. So they prefer to get their history somewhere else. So maybe the more academic, the more academic Jews will rely on or depend on Josephus, but I don't really hear religious Jews quoting Josephus that much. So anyway, so it says that Josephus describes Poppaea, the wife of Nero, as being sympathetic towards Judaism, even terming her a God-fearing woman. And apparently there's some debate about, I guess, what this term Theosebes or Theosebes means. I'm not sure how that is pronounced. But obviously the word theo in there, is the word for God in Greek. I just don't know what the Sebes part of the word means. But it says that she twice interceded successfully on behalf of the Jews. When Josephus went to Rome in 64 CE to plead for the priests imprisoned by Felix, so that's a Roman representative, he was introduced to Poppaea by the Jewish actor Alituras. And with her assistance the priests were freed, and she bestowed many gifts on Josephus himself, which is mentioned in the life of Josephus in, I guess, paragraph 16. On the second occasion she interceded on behalf of a delegation headed by the high priest Ishmael ben Fabi, sent by the priest to Rome to appeal against a decision of the procurator Festus, who, not sure, it might have been Porcius Festus, but anyway, we'll just say Festus, who had, at the request of, and if I remember correctly, that guy Festus was kind of a bastard, but anyway, the procurator Festus, who had, at the request of Agrippa II, ordered the demolition of a wall erected by the priest to prevent the king from viewing the proceedings of the temple. So Robert Eisenman, in the book James the Brother of Jesus, he calls this the temple wall affair. And I think he says it's like one of the things that led to the Roman war with the Jews. So Poppaea influenced Nero to uphold the appeal, and the wall was allowed to stand. Tacitus, who makes no mention of her attitude toward the Jews, pictures Poppaea as a corrupt and cruel woman. So, I think Tacitus, which Tacitus says some awfully racist shit, if you've ever read him, if I remember correctly. And anyway, so Tacitus, I think he would have been serving the Flavians and not really kindly disposed to those who were already on their way out, or that is, who had already left the scene, namely the Julio-Claudians. So he would have been, he's probably one of those sources where you find some really unflattering descriptions of Nero. So we see there that Josephus exposed Poppaea, and probably by extension Nero, to aspects of Judaism. So let's move on. So this is from the Antiquities, I think, which we just quoted. So anyway, it talks here about how Nero ascended to power, became emperor. Now, and he talks about some bad stuff that Nero is supposed to have done. And but then now Josephus, and this is again after Vespasian and Titus are dead and during the reign of Domitian, and I think, I could be wrong, but I think Robert Eisenman suggests that some of the stuff that Josephus says in the Antiquities may have gotten him killed by Domitian, but I don't know. Anyway, so here Josephus says, "But I omit any further discourse about these affairs," meaning the bad stuff that Nero did, "for there have been a great many who have composed the history of Nero, some of which have departed from the truth of facts out of favor, as having received benefits from him, while others, out of hatred to him and the great ill will which they bear him, have so impudently raved against him with their lies that they justly deserve to be condemned. Nor do I wonder at such as have told lies of Nero, since they have not in their writings preserved the truth of history as to those facts that were earlier than his time, even when the actors could have no way incurred their hatred, since those writers lived a long time after them. But as to those that have," and by the way, this is reading Josephus in English. It is not easy. There are very long sentences that seem to run on, and you really have to work at following what's being said. "But as to those that have no regard to truth, they may write as they please, for in that they take delight. But as to ourselves, who have made truth our direct aim, we shall briefly touch upon what only belongs remotely to this undertaking, but shall relate what hath happened to us Jews with great accuracy, and shall not grudge our pains in giving an account both of the calamities we have suffered and of the crimes we have been guilty of." So Josephus is saying, look, regarding us Jews, I'm going to tell you the truth about the crimes that have been committed against us, but I'm also going to tell you about the crimes that we were guilty of. I will now therefore return to the relation of our own affairs. So, see, this is supposed to be a history about the Jewish people, not so much about Gentiles. "For in the first year of the reign of Nero, upon the death of Azazus, king of Emesa, Schemus, or rather Shamus, his brother, succeeded in his kingdom, and Aristobulus, the son of Herod, king of Chalcis, or maybe Chalcis, as in like Chaldea, I'm not sure, was entrusted by Nero with the government of Lesser Armenia. Caesar also, and I think by Caesar he means Nero, Caesar also bestowed upon, and I think there Caesar, because maybe this was written in Greek, maybe Caesar also means the emperor, but Caesar also bestowed on Agrippa a certain part of Galilee, Tiberias and Tarichae, and ordered them to submit to his jurisdiction. He gave him also Julius, a city of Perea, with 14 villages that lay about it. Now, as for the affairs of the Jews, they grew worse and worse continually, for the country was again filled with robbers and impostors who deleted the multitude. So here it's talking about a lot of the stuff that was going on in the first century, that the events that were like leading up to the Roman war against the Jews. So it says that there was murdering going on in the temple, and really this, you know what this sounds like, and I think Josephus basically hints at this, that some of these robbers and assassins, they may have actually been Roman agents, but apparently murders were happening even in the temple, and these men didn't even think about the impiety of spilling blood in the temple. And then Josephus, and I think he gives other reasons elsewhere, he says, this seems to me to have been the reason why God, out of his hatred for these men's wickedness, rejected our city, meaning Jerusalem, and as for the temple, he no longer esteemed it sufficiently pure for him to inhabit therein, but brought the Romans upon us, and threw a fire upon the city to purge it, and brought upon us our wives and children slavery, as desirous to make us wise by our calamities. So he's saying that because of all this wickedness, he wanted to purge the Jewish, or punish the Jewish people, or to discipline them, basically. But so notice here that he doesn't say that the reason that Jerusalem was destroyed, like about 37 years after the alleged death of Jesus, that the reason that Jerusalem was being destroyed was because of the Jewish rejection of Jesus. He doesn't say that here. Moreover, he suggests that before these murders happened, the temple was considered pure enough by the Creator, and it seems to have been like part of, the Creator's, I hate to use this expression, but plan of salvation, or the means by which Israelites and people of the nations could get closer to him, we'll say. And so anyway, we'll move on. So it talks more about these robbers, and I'm trying to get back to Nero. Oh, I think it's see, his name was Porcius Festus, was sent as successor to Felix by Nero. So we'll continue. Talks about how Judea was afflicted by the robbers, while all the villages were set on fire and plundered by them. And then it was that the Sicarii, the Sicarim, the dagger men, as some call them, as they were called, who were robbers. So then he equates the dagger men, the Sicarim, with the robbers. It says they grew numerous. It it talks about the kinds of knives that they used. I'm not sure, but I think Robert Eisenman made a suggestion that the knives that they used may have actually been the knives that were used for circumcision, because I think he suggests that there were some kind of militant Jews who would forcibly circumcise people into Judaism, which I don't think that would be like an extreme expression of Judaism that would be not in keeping with at least the Judaism that exists nowadays, you know. So it's possible that that was an extreme version or perversion of Judaism that was created by the Romans in their divide and conquer strategy, to have like the real liberal, as in libertine, or I think, or I don't want to say backslidden, how would I say this? Basically just kind of like immoral, like an immoral extreme of Judaism, which would have been like Hellenism and Herodian leanings. And then at the other extreme, you would have this like militant Judaism that was like overmuch righteous, right? That was doing things that was more zealous for for the commandments of the Torah than faithful Jews were, you know. Like an example of what I'm talking about would be if, for example, Jews don't eat certain kinds of seafood, right? The fish has to have fins and scales. Well, now, if Jews got militant about whether non-Jews could eat seafood that didn't have the required fins and scales, that would be like a perversion of Judaism, because it would be pushing the commandments in a way that was not actually commanded. You see what I'm saying? It's kind of like the accusations that are actually posed allegedly by Jesus against the Pharisees, saying they enlarged their phylacteries, you know, they declare their almsgiving, their charity work in the marketplaces. You know, it's that kind of overmuch righteous behavior. So let's continue. And it talks about there's like more murdering going on in Jerusalem, and mind you, this is all during the Roman occupation. Okay, so it's not like these things are being done like without any Roman presence, right? This isn't like how Jews behave when they're left to their own devices. There's clearly something going on here, and it's not just these events. There are lots of wacky things that are happening in Jerusalem before the destruction of Jerusalem. In fact, they're very closely mirrored by lots of wacky things that are happening in America presently. And that's why they're saying that American men think like the Roman Empire is on the minds of American men so much, right? That's recently that was like a meme or an expression going around saying that, American men have the Roman Empire on their minds to an inordinate degree, right? But maybe that's because, we're seeing the signs of the fall of the Roman Empire in the form of the American Empire, because our political system, for example, is somewhat based on the Roman Senate. And so anyway, so then it talks about the Roman or the Temple Wall affair that Robert Eisenman talks about in his book. And So it says here in 193, but the Jews petitioned him to give them leave to send an embassage, or like an ambassador party, about this matter to Nero, for they said they could not endure to live if any part of the temple should be demolished. And I want to touch on that as a side note too. And when Festus had given them leave to do so, they sent 10 of their principal men to Nero, as also Ishmael the high priest and Helcias the keeper of the sacred treasure. That may not have been such a good idea, to let the empire know how much treasure the temple had. And when Nero had heard what they had to say, he not only forgave them what they had already done, but also gave them leave to let the wall they had built stand. So see, here's something nice that Nero did for the Jewish people. This was granted them in order to gratify Poppaea. So he's saying that, he was just trying to please his wife. This was granted them in order to gratify Poppaea, Nero's wife, who was a religious woman, and had requested these favors of Nero, and who gave order to the 10 ambassadors to go their way home, but retained Helcias and Ishmael as hostages with herself. As soon as the king heard this news, he gave the high priesthood to Joseph, who was called Cabby, the son of Simon, formerly high priest. But then in the life, is this the life here? Yeah. In the life, it says, I became acquainted, this is Josephus writing, I became acquainted with Alatorius, an actor of plays, Jewish by birth, and much beloved by Nero, but a Jew by birth, and through his interest became known to Poppaea, Caesar's wife, and took care as soon as possible to entreat her to procure that the priests might be set at liberty. And when, besides this favor, I had obtained many presents from Poppaea, I returned home again. So in the life, he specifically mentions that he was the one that went there, but in the Antiquities, unless I missed something, I'm not sure that he's that clear about that. Anyway, what's clear is that some Jews went to Rome, met Poppaea and Nero, and Poppaea was a religious woman, possibly a God-fearer, and the result was that some nice things were done for the Jewish people. Okay, so regarding this Temple Wall affair, if you've ever seen the movie version of The Fountainhead, written by Ayn Rand, I don't know if the movie screenplay was written by Ayn Rand, but the book, I guess, that the movie was made from was written by Ayn Rand. Anyway, in it, Howard Rourke, he has to defend why he dynamited his architectural creation, Cortland, was it Cortland Manor or Cortland Homes or something? Anyway, I think the important thing is the word courtland, because the temple had courts. Anyway, his defense is that he designed courtland to this architectural creation, this building. He was commissioned to design it, and his terms were that it would remain the way he designed it, and he didn't really require much else in terms. Well, then some business types came along and they started making modifications to his design. So then he blew it up. So he had to defend why he demolished the temple. And basically his defense is that, my terms were that my building would remain the way I designed it. And there are reasons, when watching the movie, it would probably be more obvious to me if I actually sat and watched it over again and then jotted them down and shared them with you now, but I suspect that the fountainhead is possibly a Roman explanation for why the temple was destroyed. Of course, it could be the inverse, but the Jews didn't destroy the temple, although Flavius Josephus seems to try to paint it like maybe they initially set the temple on fire, but anyway, the destruction of the temple is attributed to Titus. So it may be an explanation from the Romans as to why the temple was destroyed, because remember that they call it also the Temple of Herod. That temple was constructed, I think, at least with the sponsorship of Herod, maybe. Anyway, so an alteration of the temple's design, like with the erection of that wall, may have been considered an alteration of that design, and therefore worthy of destruction. I don't know. Anyway, I just think that the whole story, the fountainhead, seems to be talking about something more than this fictional character Howard Rourke and his fictional building. So you could check it out yourself and see what you think. Anyway, so basically what we get from this is that Josephus did go up to Rome. He did interact with Poppaea and Nero, and he did receive some favors from them. And this was 5 years before the war with Rome commenced. Or, I mean, the war with the Jews, the Roman war with the Jews commenced. So, let's see. So we can close this. And, so now our assertion is that Nero converted to Judaism, whereas all the received history about Nero says no such thing, right? So how can we have the gall, the nerve to assert this thing, and you'll get academics who will say that the Talmud is filled with all kinds of absolute nonsense and fraudulent stories and etc. But what academics often don't realize is that, like, Jews are Jewish literature has like multiple levels of meaning, right? So if you're working with just this little English translation, you might get the surface reading of it, the surface meaning, right? But you're not going to be getting, for example, any of the Hebrew word plays that might be going on, because you're not reading it in Hebrew. So there are all these levels of meaning that you're not getting, and I'll share with you what that's talking about. The Remes, I think it's called. Remes Hebrew meaning, I think that's it. Oh, Remez, okay, so Jewish hermeneutics. So in Peshat, that's Peshat, I think, is the surface meaning. Simultaneously, in any given text, Remez, meaning hint in reference to typological or allegorical interpretations, Darash, meaning search in reference to biblical study according to the midot or rules. I imagine that's referring to the rules of rabbinical hermeneutics. Maybe, I don't know. And Sod, meaning secret or mystical interpretation. The first letters of these four words were first used in medieval Spain, and that's PRDS, so Peshat, Remez, Darash, and Midot. So those are like the four outright stated levels of meaning that are happening in Jewish literature. and when I say Jewish literature, I don't mean necessarily like secular Jewish literature, although a Jewish author who was given a good Jewish education might write some secular art and apply these techniques in his art. So I don't see why you wouldn't. Like, probably one of the reasons that, and I don't know how thoroughly Steven Spielberg was educated as a young man, but he's certainly like an inheritor of Jewish intellect. It could be that Steven Spielberg, one of the reasons he's such a great director is that he might be employing these techniques in his art. But let's while we're here, because this is gonna have some bearing on what I'm gonna show you. Rules of rabbinic interpretation. That's the 7 laws of Talmudical hermeneutics. So it says, alright, well, this is a long list, so there are all these rules for. I'll just read the beginning. Talmudical hermeneutics defines the rules and methods for investigation and exact determination of the meaning of the scriptures in the Hebrew Bible within the framework of rabbinical Judaism. This includes, among others, the rules by which the requirements of the oral law and the halacha are derived from and established by the written law. These rules relate to grammar and exegesis, the interpretation of certain words and letters, and apparently superfluous and or missing words or letters, and prefixes and suffixes. So even the absence of a word that you would expect to be there can have meaning in a passage of Hebrew scripture or Hebrew oral tradition. The interpretation of those letters, which in certain words are provided with vowel points, which vowel points were added later, but like sometimes what you'll read is where the sages will say, no, don't read this word as this, rather read it as that. For example, and this is probably a very simple example, bat versus bet. Bat is a daughter, bet is a house. So there may be a passage that mentions a house, and the sages might say, no, don't read it bet, rather read it bat, meaning daughter, and then that changes the meaning of the passage, you know. So like the pronunciation of words and passages is actually provided by Jewish oral tradition. And that's the thing, is that like especially Christians who are so against Jewish oral tradition, never mind that they're all for Christian oral tradition, they don't understand that lots of things are derived from Jewish oral tradition, like because Hebrew is mostly consonants, not vowel sounds. Jewish oral tradition provides the vowel pointings. And not just that, but Jewish oral tradition also provides the canon of the Hebrew Tanakh. It lets us know which books were accepted, used, considered reliable and authoritative in the Jewish community. Without Jewish tradition, Christians would have to rely entirely on Christian oral tradition as to which books of the Hebrew Tanakh, or what they term the Old Testament, should be in their Bible. And that just also shows that Christians don't understand that the Christian canon of Scripture also comes from Christian oral tradition. Like which epistles are permitted, which books are permitted in the New Testament. That doesn't come from the New Testament. That comes from Christian oral tradition. And I say oral, but it doesn't have to be oral. It could be actually written, Christian written tradition. But the point is that it's tradition that is not found in the canonical scripture. So in other words, both with the Hebrew Tanakh and with the Christian New Testament, the canonical scripture doesn't tell us which books of scripture are canonical. That comes from the interpretive community, which in the case of the Hebrew Tanakh is the Jewish people, in the case of the Christian scriptures is the Christian church. right? And that's why if you're against like tradition in your Bible walk, you're ignorant. You're basically ignorant. You're throwing out all of the legacy of your religion. You're basically saying that all of this work of these better Christians than you were is worthless. You know, and it's the same for the Jewish people. If Jews were to throw out the oral tradition, they're basically saying that all this work that these righteous Jews engaged in is worthless. You know, and how much of a good Jew could you call yourself if you did that? And this comes from this perspective comes from people who think that they know more than they do and that they're smarter than they really are, or that they're so in tune to God that they can just get, you know, they can just get the info straight from God and they don't need any of that mental knowledge, you know. And that kind of whole way of thinking, I've even seen it lead to a perspective where the person doesn't even study their own canonical scriptures because they think that the letter of the law killeth. So they actually took, a Christian actually took the Christian phrase from the New Testament, the letter killeth, and applied it to the Christian scriptures. I'm not even British, and I was gobsmacked when I heard that one, because that's just the height of stupidity. So anyway, you can go over these rules, you know, for your own personal knowledge. I've you know, read like these rules before, and I'm not like thoroughly schooled in them, but the little bit that I've been exposed to them have helped me to actually see things that have probably kind of been secret for a long time, because most people don't read a text critically. Most people aren't looking for multiple levels of meaning in a text, because they may even be ignorant that those levels even exist, right? So why would you look for something you don't even know exists? And I'll show you how these rules helped me to see something that, in my mind at least, proves that Nero did convert to Judaism. As the Babylonian Talmud, I thought it was the Jerusalem Talmud, and it's possible that the same story may be found in the Jerusalem Talmud in a more extended form, because I thought there was something anyway, but apparently it is found in the Babylonian Talmud also. So anyway, those are the rules. So back to Gittin Folio 56, Tractate Gittin Folio 56a. So here it's talking about another reason that the temple was destroyed and the sanctuary burned, and Jews being exiled from the land. And then it gets to Nero. The Roman authorities then sent, and a lot of this discussion, by the way, is from events that happened in the first century. So it's very interesting if you're a student of first century history. The Roman authorities then sent Nero Caesar against the Jews. When he came to Jerusalem, he wished to test his fate. He shot an arrow to the east, and the arrow came and fell on Jerusalem. He then shot another arrow to the west, and it also fell on Jerusalem. He shot an arrow in all four directions of the heavens, and each time the arrow fell in Jerusalem. Nero then conducted another test. He said to a child, "Tell me a verse that you learned today." He said to him as follows, "And I will lay my vengeance upon Edom by the hand of my people Israel." Nero said, "The Holy One, blessed be He," which, just that formulation, "the Holy One, blessed be He," if Nero actually said that, that would show that Nero had been fairly well exposed to Judaism at that point. Nero said, "The Holy One, blessed be He, wishes to destroy his temple, and he wishes to wipe his hands with that man," meaning himself. And then it explains the Romans are associated with Edom, the descendants of Esau. And I'm not sure if that's in a metaphorical way, but I think the Dead Sea Scrolls also kind of express the same idea. But I can tell you that in the first century, according to Flavius Josephus, the Edomites, or the Idumeans, sided with the Romans, even though they were supposed to have corporately converted to Judaism at one point. Apparently they just like corporately changed their mind and then started working for the Romans against the Jews. So then Nero says, "If I continue on this mission, I will eventually be punished for having served as God's agent to bring about the destruction." So he, Nero, fled and became a convert, or in other places it says a proselyte. And ultimately Rabbi Meir descended from him. Now, Rabbi Meir is a very famous rabbi in Judaism, so for Rabbi Meir to be descended from Nero, that certainly, that's a pretty tremendous accolade. And then after that it says that the Roman authorities then sent Vespasian Caesar against the Jews. So this means that Nero fled Rome, and or at least Roman authority or Roman custody, and he became a convert to Judaism. So what would have happened when he became a convert? He would have been circumcised, right? And then you could read more. There's like tons more here, which talks about the Zealots, you know, the Sicarim, and it talks about Titus. It even mentions Jesus the Nazarene. Talks about Balaam the prophet, Balaam, the false prophet, and anyway. But we can dwell on those passages more another time. Now here's an interesting discussion. Why does Nero convert to Judaism in Folio 56a and Tractate Gittin in the Babylonian Talmud? And he doesn't mention the Jerusalem Talmud, so maybe it wasn't actually in the Jerusalem Talmud, but I know I was shown something that was really key to my understanding from the Jerusalem Talmud. But anyway, yeah, see, furthermore, Rabbi Meir is considered to be one of his star descendants. Um, so this person says, while I recognize that this is probably fictional and folklore, why would the rabbinical scribes even insert this portion in the text? What purpose does it serve? So he's just assuming because Christian history has presented a completely different history of Nero. He's just assuming it's fictional and folklore. So here this person says, I want to say you that if Nero really converted, I am sure 100% that in history books of Christians they refuted to reveal this. And I don't exactly know what they're trying to say here, except that they probably the Christian history differed on this point. So then I came across a possible explanation as to why the rabbis would insert this brief tidbit about Nero converting to Judaism into the narrative. If it wasn't factual, if there are sources supporting that his conversion was factual, please do list. That would be interesting. Well, I have one, as I'm about to reveal. But I would have to log in to participate in this discussion. In Jeffrey Rubinstein's Talmudic Stories, Narrative Art, Composition, and Culture, he dedicates an entire chapter to Gittin 55b through 56b. He theorizes that not only does this passage deal with the obvious destruction of Jerusalem, but with the rabbinic authority. Throughout the passage we see how the sages' inability to decide due to being too cautious leads to destruction. Rubinstein posits that Nero's presence is to serve as a stark contrast to the sages. Like the sages, Nero displays caution by soliciting an oracle that his imperial commission to attack Jerusalem meets divine approval. So see, by this point, Nero had already sent Vespasian to go to war, and it was while the war was happening that Nero is, according to the accepted history, supposed to have committed suicide, but according to Jewish history, supposed to have converted to Judaism. So so then Nero sought additional confirmation by consulting the child and having him rehearse a scripture which details the destruction of Jerusalem. Nero, like the sages, faces a difficult decision. The rabbis had previously faced a difficult decision on how to react to a host treating an unwanted guest at a banquet, as well as how to handle the emperor's blemished calf he personally offered. Nero acts by not destroying Jerusalem, by fleeing and converting to Judaism, thereby avoiding the clutches of the emperor, demonstrating his faith in the God of Israel and siding with the ultimate victor. It is here that Rubinstein explains this antidote, the strange non-historical account. See, he says it's non-historical, but I'm about to show that I think it really is historical. The strange non-historical account functions as an ironic foil with which to compare the behavior of the sages. When pressed to act by the emperor, they do not seek omens or inquire of children or turn to the text themselves. Nero, the Roman, the pagan, the Goy, in other words, the Gentile, does. He does turn to sources to get confirmation. Nero's courage produces a rabbinic authority, namely Rabbi Meir, and the proliferation of Torah. Rabbinic cowardice leads to the destruction of Jerusalem. Essentially, according to Rubinstein, the Nero scene is an ironic slap in the face to the sages who failed to act because even the wicked pagan Nero knew to seek counsel from a higher being, etc. Now this is Rubinstein's interpretation. I would be interested to know what other interpretations are out there, and if there are supporting evidences for Nero's conversion. So I'm going to leave this up because I may want to return to this page, but so here is an article, the date of Nero's death. Now here it says that Jerome, the length of Nero's reign by Jerome was calculated as 13 years, 7 months, and 28 days. Alright, that is not what Josephus says. Josephus in Wars of the Jews, chapter 9, I guess. Let's see, let's go up here. In book 4, chapter 9, right? Which, it's funny, it was in chapter 9, but so it says, now as Vespasian was returned to Caesarea and was getting ready with all his army to march directly to Jerusalem, he was informed that Nero was dead after he had reigned 13 years and 8 days. But as to any narration after what manner he abused his power in the government and committed the management of affairs to those vile wretches, Nymphidius and Tigellinus, his unworthy freedmen, and how he had a plot laid against him by them, and was deserted by all his guards, and ran away with 4 of his most trusty freedmen, and slew himself in the suburbs of Rome, and how those that occasioned his death were in no long time brought themselves to punishment. And then Galba was made emperor. So anyway, then it's talking about the transference of the imperial throne. Now the important thing here is where it says, mind you, Josephus, who's supposedly a Jewish prisoner of war in Roman custody, is writing these Wars of the Jews. Now, the alternative is that this history was actually written by the Roman Flavians and that Josephus never existed. But I'm about to show you that a very Jewish method is used to report some information about Nero here, where it says that Nero was dead after he had reigned 13 years and 8 days. Now, I read this after I was told by the Orthodox Jewish rabbi about that passage in Gittin 56a in the Babylonian Talmud about the conversion of Nero. So on reading this, where it says he had reigned 13 years and 8 days, I asked myself the question, who cares about 8 days? Do you know the answer to that question? Who cares about 8 days? Jews do, because a Jewish male, newborn, must be circumcised on the 8th day. Now, okay, what about 13 years? Now we already see that this calculation of the length of Nero's reign is not the same as the one that Jerome gave us. Now, Jerome lived, I think, a few centuries after Flavius Josephus, so which one's more reliable? I don't know. But it doesn't matter, because what I'm going to show you is that this is a reference to Genesis chapter 17, Abraham and the covenant of circumcision. So how do we know that? So if I just go to the beginning and I type in 13 years, two passages come up with the words 13 years. Genesis 17:25 and 1 Kings chapter 7 verse 1. And this one is about Solomon was building his own house 13 years and he finished all his house. But Genesis chapter 17 verse 25, and Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And I'm not sure, but I've heard that maybe Muslims circumcise at 13 years old. I don't know if that's true or not, or that maybe it was an Arab practice in the past. I don't know if that's true or not. But in the Torah, in Genesis chapter 17, the chapter about circumcision, Ishmael is circumcised at 13 years old. Okay, well, what about the figure 8 days? Well, there are more passages that use the words 8 days, at least in English, but yeah. So those aren't exact matches, but we have 3 passages in the Tanakh that use the words 8 days in English. And then in Genesis chapter 21 verse 4, of course, it talks about Isaac being 8 days old when he was circumcised. And then talks about in 2 Chronicles the sanctification of the house of the Lord in 8 days. But again, Genesis chapter 17, and he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man child in your generations, he that is born in the house or bought with money of any stranger which is not of thy seed. So the figure 13 years occurs in Genesis 17, and the figure 8 days occurs in Genesis 17, and those words do not occur in the same chapter in any other chapter of the whole Hebrew Tanakh. So Flavius Josephus is telling us that Nero was circumcised, and that mortal wound that the beast was supposed to have suffered, well, yeah, when Nero was circumcised, that was the death of his Gentile person, and essentially the birth of his Jewish persona. So Flavius Josephus is telling his Jewish readers in code that they would understand that Nero was circumcised. And that's why possibly the Babylonian Talmud also knows that Nero converted to Judaism. And that's using rabbinical rules of interpretation.